welcome to the deep dive. I'm so incredibly glad you're joining us today because we have a truly fascinating journey ahead of us.
You really do.
But before we even get started, do me a quick favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.
Yes, please do.
It really helps us grow. It tells the algorithms you want more of this kind of content, and it allows us to keep bringing you these extensive deep dives.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, our mission is to review and analyze a self-published 2025 ebook that has been quietly but aggressively making serious waves across the internet.
Huge waves.
It's titled Degenerate Lifestyles Enabled by Leftist Satanism, written by Conrad Riker. Now, I know that title alone is a lot to take in.
It's a very heavy title.
It really is. But here's the thing. To truly understand the modern cultural divides we see fracturing society everywhere today, you have to actually read the primary texts that are driving those divides.
You can't just read about them.
Right. You can't just read the commentary. You have to go to the source. Yeah. And this book offers a fascinating, completely unfiltered look into the worldview of the modern men's rights movement and what is often referred to as the red-pilled manosphere. Riker's text claims to explain the hidden history of our major institutions, our public schools, the mainstream media, the military, the family courts, before they were, in his exact words, captured by feminists and Marxists.
This is a massive premise.
It is a sweeping, highly controversial critique of modern society. And if you want to dive directly into the mind of this movement and read the manifesto for yourself, the author strongly urges you to check out the book on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books, and to follow his ongoing work at the handle at Conrad Riker on Substack.
And before we go a single step further, I need to step in with a crucial clarification for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
It is vital to note that this text is highly, highly politically charged. We are exploring this book today strictly as an artifact of a growing cultural rebellion.
Yeah.
We are not endorsing, validating, or condemning the author's viewpoints. Our mission here is purely to synthesize the text so that you can understand the actual arguments being made by this specific demographic movement.
Just laying out the facts of the book.
Exactly. We are looking at this through a completely analytical, impartial lens to decode what is resonating so deeply with the millions of readers who are engaging with this material right now.
Exactly. I love that framing. We are here to read the map, to understand the topography of this movement, not to tell you which destination you should drive to.
Well said.
So let's start where the author starts, setting the foundation in his preface. The overarching premise the book sets up here is what Riker calls the unseen war on manhood and the systematic pathologizing of men.
His core thesis is intense right out of the gate.
It really is. He argues that society isn't just naturally evolving or shifting its norms through some organic process of progress.
Right, he rejects that entirely.
Instead, he believes it is deliberately and methodically eroding everything that historically made men strong, and by extension, nations great. He calls this a quiet war.
And he claims it's being waged not with bullets or tanks, but via culture, education, media, and the law.
Yeah. He writes that men are essentially being punished for doing exactly what historically has been considered right, for being traditional, for being protectors, for being providers.
What's fascinating here is how Riker targets very specific credentialed institutions to build this case. He doesn't just make broad, sweeping philosophical claims about society disliking men. He zeroes in on the medical and psychological establishment.
Big APA, right?
Yes, he points directly to the American Psychological Association, the APA, and specifically their 2018 guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men.
I remember those came out.
Riker takes massive foundational issue with these guidelines because, as he points out by quoting the text directly, they labeled traditional masculine traits, things like stoicism, competitiveness, and self-reliance, as fundamentally harmful.
Harmful. That's the word they used.
Yes. And Riker argues that this isn't science at all. He calls it politics wearing a lab coat.
Right, because historically, stoicism was viewed as a virtue. It was the ability to keep your head in a crisis, to not let your emotions dictate your actions when things fall apart.
Exactly.
And suddenly, according to the book's reading of these guidelines, that exact trait is being diagnosed as a psychological defect. And he backs up his skepticism of the APA by tracing the money.
Precisely. The text notes that the report was funded in part by grants tied to feminist organizations and university gender studies departments.
Wow.
He uses this funding pipeline as concrete evidence that the institution of psychology has been ideologically compromised.
So it's not about helping anymore.
According to him, no. It's no longer about finding the best way to help a struggling man. It's about retrofitting that man to align with a specific ideological framework.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Riker doesn't just leave it at a critique of the APA. He introduces this overarching concept he calls the psychological red pill.
This part is crucial to his whole argument.
And the way he describes this is chilling if you follow his logic. He says that the modern male experience is a three-step trap.
Let's break those down.
First, men are shamed for their natural masculinity, their aggression, their desire to compete, their stoicism.
Right, step one is shaming.
Second, they are actively pathologized by therapists for not being emotionally vulnerable in the specific communicative way that modern, often female-centric therapy demands.
So if they don't communicate in that specific style, they are labeled broken.
Exactly. And finally, the third step, they are medicated for the resulting confusion and depression. He argues that the entire system profits from this disorientation by selling weakness as strength and calling it healing.
It's an analogy that completely reframes how this movement views the mental health industry.
Totally. They don't see a therapist's couch as a place of healing. They see it as a system of control designed to break male autonomy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker is outlining a framework where the therapeutic state is actively institutionally hostile to male biology. He's suggesting that if you are a man functioning as a man, the medical system views you as a patient who needs to be cured of your nature.
But what makes this book more than just a list of grievances is how he documents the pushback.
Right, the resistance.
He doesn't just paint a picture of men as passive victims of this system. He points to active, tangible resistance. For example, he highlights the legislative level, pointing to Texas passing Senate Bill 12 in 2022.
Ah, yes.
This was a bill that explicitly banned public schools from teaching the concept of toxic masculinity. Riker frames this not just as a political win, but as a necessary legal boundary against ideological overreach into the minds of young boys.
And he also talks about how men are adapting on a grassroots interpersonal level, which I found totally fascinating.
The dad tribes.
Yes, he describes this phenomenon that he calls dad tribes. These are fathers who have completely given up on the traditional systems of support.
Because they think they're rigged.
Exactly. Instead of going to family counselors or traditional lawyers, they are using encrypted messaging apps like Signal and Telegram to form private, invite-only underground networks.
And what are they doing in these encrypted chats?
They are sharing legal loopholes, custody hacks, and highly specific strategies to fight family courts.
They are completely bypassing therapists and the traditional legal advice networks.
Because they believe those networks are rigged against them. The book presents this as a strategic, raw response to a hostile system. It's literally a digital resistance movement forming right under the radar.
This raises an important question, and it's one the author anticipates you, the reader, asking. How did the system get this way in the eyes of the manosphere?
Right, how did the institutions flip?
Riker answers this by tracing the roots of the issue, which leads us to his arguments concerning the capture of education and what he calls the woke virus.
To explain this, Riker leans heavily on the Marxist model of cultural hegemony.
By Gramsci.
Yes, originally articulated by the early 20th century Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully because this is a dense academic concept, but it's clearly the engine driving the book's entire theory. Let's do is sort of explain it like on 5 for Gramsci's cultural hegemony.
Sure.
Is he basically saying that instead of taking over a country with a violent military coup with tanks in the streets and armed revolutions, you just quietly take over the HR departments, the teachers' unions, the universities, and the movie studios until everyone just naturally assumes your ideology is the only correct way to think?
That is exactly the mechanism. Gramsci argued that traditional violent Marxist revolutions failed in Western democracies because the working class actually liked their culture and their religion.
They didn't want a violent overthrow.
Right. So the new strategy became infiltration. You don't overthrow the capitalist system by attacking the government directly. You slowly infiltrate its cultural institutions.
You get the schools, the media, the churches.
And you slowly redefine the societal norms. You change the vocabulary, you change what is considered acceptable.
And you do this over decades.
Decades. So that eventually, any resistance to the new Marxist ideology seems not just politically incorrect, but morally illegitimate. Riker claims this exact, deliberate playbook has been perfectly executed in the American education system over the last 50 years.
It is a terrifying concept if you view the world through this lens, because it means the enemy isn't at the gates. They are writing the textbooks.
And Riker uses very specific, modern examples to show how history is being, as he puts it, annexed.
He goes straight after the 1619 Project.
Driven by Nicole Anna Jones at the New York Times, which has been adapted into school curricula across the country.
According to the text, this project deliberately ignores the unifying aspirational ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Instead, it frames the entire foundation of America purely around slavery, oppression, and racial hierarchy.
The author argues that this isn't a historical debate, it's a political forgery.
A political forgery.
Wow! Its sole design, he claims, is to induce guilt and self-loathing in the next generation of American citizens, particularly young white men.
And he builds on that macro-level media project with micro-level local examples to show that this is a systemic, grassroots issue, not just an elite media project.
He cites a highly publicized 2021 incident.
The Seattle public school teacher.
Yes, who was caught on audio calling George Washington a terrorist because he led a rebellion against the British Crown.
Riker asks the reader to look at the logical extreme of this kind of teaching. If George Washington is a terrorist, then by definition, every single founding father is a terrorist.
And if the founders are terrorists, then the very foundation of the United States is inherently illegitimate and must be dismantled.
He argues that words like terrorist are being deliberately weaponized in classrooms to delegitimize patriotism itself.
And the book claims this isn't just happening in rogue classrooms, it's institutional policy. He points to the University of California system.
Oh, right, the AT history thing.
In 2023, the UC system actually moved to reject advanced placement U.S. history scores from incoming high school freshmen.
Because the traditional AP course allegedly glorified colonialism.
Just imagine that scenario for a second. You are a high school student, you study incredibly hard for an entire year, you pass a rigorous national AP test, and then a major university system rejects your college credit because the objective historical facts you learn don't align with their specific modern ideology.
Riker also brings up public school districts, like Denver high schools, completely replacing traditional U.S. history classes with ethnic studies.
According to the book, these new classes focus almost entirely on deconstructing dominant historical narratives through the hyper-focused lens of colonialism, intersectionality, and white privilege.
What Riker is describing through all these educational examples is a concept he coined as narrative supremacy.
This is a crucial term in his worldview.
Narrative supremacy is the idea that in modern education, emotional storytelling, personal lived experience, and grievance absolutely trump factual accuracy and objective historical timelines.
Under narrative supremacy, the perspective of the most aggrieved or historically marginalized group becomes the only valid, unquestionable truth.
Schools, he argues, have fundamentally abandoned their original mandate, which was the transmission of objective knowledge and critical thinking skills.
Instead, they have shifted entirely toward ideological formation.
They are no longer producing thinkers who are equipped to ask difficult questions. They are producing believers who are trained to chant approved slogans.
It's a fundamental engineered shift in the purpose of education, moving from enlightenment to indoctrination.
Okay, we need to take a breath here because that is an incredibly heavy, sweeping accusation against the entire educational apparatus.
It is.
But to really understand this worldview, we have to follow Riker's logic to its next step. If schools are where the ideological foundation is laid, according to the book, the legal system is where the trap actually snaps shut on men in adulthood.
He makes a direct line from what kids are taught about male toxicity to how adult fathers are treated in the courts.
And that brings us to his analysis of family courts, Title IX's, and what he bluntly calls the feminist trap. And he starts this argument with a fascinating look back at the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1972.
Now, if you read most conventional history books, this act is universally framed as a massive, overdue victory for women's rights.
Because it finally allowed women to get credit cards and mortgages in their own names without requiring a husband or a father as a male cosigner.
But Riker has a highly controversial, totally inverted take on this.
His reinterpretation of economic history here is deeply provocative. The author claims that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act didn't actually liberate women in the long run.
Instead, he argues it weaponized financial independence to systematically make fathers obsolete.
By allowing women to bypass men economically, it allowed the state, the government, to step in and replace the traditional family structure.
The state became the ultimate provider and protector, rendering the biological father economically redundant.
It's a wild way to look at it. The economic freedom for one group was actually a Trojan horse to destroy the nuclear family.
And Riker uses this historical economic pivot to transition into his critique of the modern legal system, specifically family courts.
He argues that today Western courts treat fathers as completely and utterly disposable.
They're viewed as highly convenient when it comes to extracting alimony and paying child support, but fundamentally optional or even detrimental when it comes to the actual day-to-day parenting and decision-making for their children.
To illustrate this disposable nature of fathers, he shares a highly disturbing legal precedent involving a man named Marcus in British Columbia.
This case is intense. In 2023, Marcus was dragged into family court and ultimately fined $10,000 by a judge for causing emotional harm to his child.
And what was his crime? He persistently called his child daughter and used female pronouns, which aligned with her biological sex but went against her newly chosen gender identity.
Riker frames this not just as a bizarre legal anomaly, but as state-sanctioned linguistic castration.
He argues that the court didn't just punish Marcus's free speech. They legally punished his foundational right to fatherhood and his right to acknowledge biological reality in his own home.
The state essentially told him, your biological reality is subordinate to our ideological reality, and we will bankrupt you if you disagree.
That story is genuinely wild, and Riker uses it to show how the legal trap closes on adult men in family courts. But then he pivots to show how this same legal framework is deployed against younger men on college campuses.
Unpacking Title IX in massive detail.
Riker traces the current erosion of young men's rights on campus directly back to a very specific bureaucratic moment: the 2011 Dear Colleague letter issued by the Obama administration's Department of Education.
He claims the single memo effectively destroyed the presumption of innocence and removed due process for any male student accused of sexual misconduct.
The mechanics of how this happened, according to the text, are vital to understand. The book claims that this federal guidance coerced universities into eliminating basic legal protections.
It essentially eliminated the right to cross-examination and often barred the accused from presenting exculpatory evidence or even seeing the full details of the complaint against them.
It created a shadow justice system on campuses where men were assumed guilty the moment an accusation was filed, unless they were wealthy enough to hire top-tier civil rights attorneys to sue the school.
And to be fair at the timeline, the author does acknowledge the political ping-pong of this issue. He notes that Betsy DeVos, under the Trump administration, reinstated basic due process rights in 2020.
She brought back the requirement for live hearings and the right to cross-examine witnesses through an advisor.
But then Riker emphasizes the Biden administration immediately reversed these protections in 2023, reinstating the much lower preponderance of evidence standard.
Right, and that standard is the crux of the issue for Riker.
Preponderance of evidence essentially means it is 51% likely that something happened. It's the more likely than not standard used in civil lawsuits, not the beyond a reasonable doubt standard used in criminal courts.
Riker argues that applying this incredibly low burden of proof to life-altering accusations turns complex, alcohol-fueled, he said, she said, college encounters into automatic guilty verdicts and expulsions for men.
And he provides a chilling example of how this plays out in reality from the University of Oregon in 2022.
A male student was expelled for the non-consensual recording of an intimate encounter. But here is the massive catch that Riker points out.
According to the documentation, both parties had initially agreed to the consensual encounter, and both had agreed to the recording at the time it happened.
But months later, when the relationship turned sour and they had a falling out, the female student retroactively withdrew her consent for the past event and filed a Title IX complaint.
The university sided with her and expelled him, ruining his academic career.
Riker uses this to argue a very dark point: that male rights, male consent, and male futures on campus are entirely negotiable and easily discarded, while female accusations are treated as sacred, retroactive, and completely unassailable by university administrators.
If we look at how Riker transitions from this legal erasure of male rights to the biological erasure of sex itself, we enter a section of the book that is perhaps the most hotly contested.
He titles this section Gender Insanity and the Erasure of Biology.
Riker introduces his arguments on modern gender ideology by framing it as the ultimate, final battleground for reality itself.
For Riker, if you can convince a society to abandon the reality of biology, you can convince them to accept any form of tyranny.
He insists that the biological binary is not a spectrum, and it is absolutely not up for debate.
To support this, he points to 2023 data from the CDC stating that 99.98% of humans are born unambiguously chromosomally male or female.
He argues that gender activists deliberately use the incredibly rare instances of intersex conditions, which affect less than 0.02% of the population, as a rhetorical wedge to justify erasing the concept of a biological binary for the entire 99.98% of the population.
Right. The way he puts it is brilliant in its simplicity. He says it's exactly like demanding we ban all cars from the road, because 0.001% of them have a manufacturing defect in the steering wheel.
It's using an anomaly to destroy the rule.
And from there, he goes incredibly hard after the medical interventions being aggressively pushed on vulnerable children and teenagers.
Riker points to a massive, highly revealing 2023 study published in JAMA Psychiatry.
This study revealed that teenagers who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria have disturbingly high rates of severe overlapping psychological conditions.
The data found that 30% of these teens were on the autism spectrum, 55% were suffering from clinical depression, and 48% had documented severe trauma histories.
Yet, despite these glaring red flags, Riker claims that the WPATH guidelines, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which sets the standard of care in the U.S., completely bypass these massive underlying psychological issues.
Instead of addressing the trauma or the autism, he argues, the medical establishment pushes for immediate, irreversible medical and surgical intervention.
This is where Riker broadens the lens and contrasts the United States' aggressive approach with what is happening in Europe, which he claims exposes the ideological capture of American medicine.
He points heavily to the United Kingdom's Cass Review, published in 2023. This was an independent, exhaustive review of gender identity services for children.
And the Cass Review found incredibly weak, practically non-existent evidence supporting the long-term benefits of a social or medical transition for minors.
This review actually led to the shuttering of the Tavistock Clinic, England's primary pediatric gender clinic.
He also highlights Sweden's massive policy reversal in 2022, where they halted almost all youth gender transitions outside of strict research settings.
Following in a nationwide evaluation that exposed very poor long-term psychological results and severe physical side effects.
Riker uses these major international reversals as concrete proof that the U.S. medical system is captured by a radical ideology.
He argues they are pushing dangerous, irreversible experimentation on society's most vulnerable youth, all while successfully masking it behind the euphemism of affirming care.
It is a devastatingly heavy accusation against the medical establishment. He is essentially accusing doctors of malpractice on a generational scale.
But an obvious question arises for you reading this. If this is all happening, and the data from Europe is so clear, why isn't the American public outraged? How is this continuing?
And Riker's answer to that takes us into the next major pillar of his theory: media manipulation, Hollywood, and what he calls narrative capture.
Let's dive deep into his arguments here.
The premise here is that the mainstream media doesn't actually report the news anymore. They don't investigate facts. They manufacture consent.
He brings up a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as the illusory truth effect.
This is a cognitive bias, where if you repeat a lie or specific framing often enough across multiple platforms, the human brain eventually just accepts it as truth out of sheer repetition and cognitive fatigue.
To ground this psychological theory in reality, Riker points to the media's handling of the Kyle Rittenhouse case as a prime, undeniable example.
He notes that prominent commentators on networks like MSNBC, specifically naming Chris Hayes, were repeatedly broadcasting to millions of viewers that Rittenhouse was a domestic terrorist and an active shooter.
And they were doing this before the basic foundational facts of the case, like who attacked who, and the timeline of events were even established by law enforcement, let alone a jury.
Riker argues this isn't sloppy journalism, it's deliberate ideological enforcement.
The media was attempting to speak a narrative into existence to secure a political outcome, regardless of the objective video evidence that later cleared Rittenhouse on grounds of self-defense.
He also heavily critiques how the media establishment weaponized the "Believe All Women" slogan during the peak of the Me Too movement around 2020.
The author claims this phrase was never actually about seeking justice or protecting victims. It was a highly effective operational tool designed to completely bypass the constitutional legal presumption of innocence.
It allowed the media to try, convict, and professionally execute men in the court of public opinion without requiring a single shred of due process or corroborating evidence.
And here's where Riker brings up a figure who is unavoidable when discussing the manosphere, Andrew Tate.
Riker uses Tate as the ultimate modern example of what he calls the double bind that men are placed in today. Now remember, we are just looking at the book's framing here.
Right, maintaining our objective lens.
Riker points out that Tate initially built his massive empire by telling young, lost men to take extreme personal responsibility. He told them to hit the gym, to stop making excuses, to build wealth, and to be unapologetically masculine.
But because Tate didn't conform to the approved, softened, therapeutic version of masculinity, Riker argues the media apparatus hunted him like a geopolitical extremist.
They labeled him a profound threat to society, while massive tech platforms simultaneously coordinated behind the scenes to completely suppress and wipe his content from the internet.
Riker says this perfectly illustrates the bind modern men are caught in. If you show traditional power, assertiveness, and unapologetic masculinity, you are immediately demonized, labeled toxic, and deplatformed by the system.
And Riker extends this critique of media manipulation beyond just news networks and social media influencers, directly into the heart of Hollywood and corporate entertainment.
He highlights a very specific cultural artifact to make his point, a 2021 Cadillac Super Bowl commercial.
In this ad, a father looks intensely at his son and delivers the line, "You are the son of a bitch who will change the world."
On the absolute surface level, it looks like a rare, powerful celebration of strong, traditional fatherhood and male ambition.
But Riker argues this actually reveals Hollywood's profound hypocritical double standard. He claims the media, Hollywood, and corporate America only tolerate and broadcast strong men when they are fictional, highly scripted, and ultimately contained safely within the boundaries of corporate sponsorships.
If a real, living man were to speak with that kind of raw, unfiltered power and unapologetic confidence in the real world, say, in a corporate boardroom or on a college campus, Riker argues, he would be immediately investigated by HR, sued for creating a hostile environment, or publicly canceled.
Society loves the image of male strength on a screen, but actively persecutes the reality of it in everyday life.
Which perfectly brings us to the actual mechanism of that persecution and cancellation.
If you step out of line, who enforces the penalty?
According to the text, that role is played by big tech.
This leads us to the author's extensive claims regarding tech tyranny, censorship, and what he ominously labels digital feudalism.
Riker goes incredibly deep into the mechanics of how Silicon Valley operates not as a neutral public square, but as an active, ideological enforcer.
He calls the current tech landscape the Silicon Valley panopticon, referencing the prison design, where inmates behave because they feel they are constantly being watched, even if they aren't.
To prove this isn't just paranoia, he cites a massive 2023 study by the Stanford Internet Observatory.
This study analyzed AI moderation tools and found that these algorithms flag conservative or right-leaning content as toxic or hateful at a rate 3.2 times higher than liberal content.
And here is the kicker Riker emphasizes. This extreme disparity happens even when the syntax, the vocabulary, and the tone of the posts are completely identical.
It's the underlying political viewpoint itself that the artificial intelligence has been explicitly trained to punish and suppress.
To understand how these companies became so aggressively ideological, Riker traces the origins of this corporate inquisition back to a pivotal moment in 2017.
He focuses on James Damore's infamous internal Google memo.
Damore, a software engineer, merely questioned using peer-reviewed psychological data whether inherent biological differences in interest and temperament might partially explain why fewer women choose to dominate highly stressful, system-oriented engineering roles.
For simply suggesting this biological possibility in an internal forum meant for debate, he was publicly excoriated and immediately fired.
Riker uses the Damore incident as patient zero to show that tech companies don't just enforce behavioral policies, they enforce strict ideological purity.
Any deviation from the blank slate, gender constructivist narratives is met with professional execution.
And the book argues that once they perfected that ideological enforcement internally, they turned it outward onto the public.
Riker moves to the macro level, discussing the unprecedented 2020 suppression of the New York Post's Hunter Biden laptop story. We all remember this.
Facebook and Twitter actively blocked users from sharing a legitimate, factually accurate news story published by one of the oldest newspapers in the country, just weeks before presidential election.
They locked the accounts of journalists and regular citizens alike. Riker argues this wasn't just tech companies making a mistake. He calls it state-adjacent censorship.
It was the intelligence community and private tech platforms acting as proxies for each other to rig the information pipeline and protect a specific political outcome.
And the author makes it clear that it's not just about controlling what you can say or read. It's about controlling your ability to survive in the modern economy.
He brings up the chilling example of PayPal freezing $10 million in crowdfunded donations meant for the Canadian truckers who were peacefully protesting COVID-19 vaccine mandates in 2022.
Think about the implications of that. Overnight, without a single court order, without a trial, a tech company decided that thousands of working-class men shouldn't have access to their own legally acquired money because the company disagreed with their politics.
Riker points out how genuinely terrifying this new reality is. Your money is no longer unconditionally yours.
It is only conditionally yours, pending the ongoing approval of an unelected ideological gatekeeper sitting in a glass office in Silicon Valley.
And the insidious, quiet nature of this control is what Riker focuses on next, discussing algorithmic shadow banning.
It's not always as loud as seizing $10 million. Sometimes it's just turning off your microphone without telling you.
He cites a 2022 University of Toronto study revealing that TikTok's algorithm deliberately reduced the visibility and reach of right-leaning posts 5.6 times more aggressively than left-leaning ones.
It's invisible, frictionless censorship. You think you are speaking to the world, but the algorithm has placed you in a soundproof room.
And Riker warns that this technology is escalating rapidly. He discusses Meta Facebook's parent company patenting predictive content moderation.
This is a technology designed to analyze a user's past behavior, off-platform browsing habits, and linguistic patterns to flag them as a violator before they even make a post.
It is literal pre-crime. Because of this absolute control over communication and commerce, Riker refers to these tech billionaires, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Sundar Pichai, as unelected medieval lords.
He claims they are practicing digital feudalism, where we are all just digital serfs allowed to exist in their public square only as long as we pay our ideological tithes and never question their progressive biases.
So this brings us to a massive, crucial pivot in the book.
If the schools are indoctrinating the youth, if the family courts are rigged against fathers, if the media is manufacturing lies, and if the tech platforms will unperson you for speaking out, how are men actually reacting to this total systemic hostility?
This leads to what I believe is one of the most fascinating sociological observations in the entire text, found in Section 7, the consumer cult, neotribalism, and the NEET rebellion.
Riker argues that capitalism, the system men historically built and defended, actually betrayed them.
He claims that as traditional avenues for male status and community were dismantled by the forces we've discussed, men traded genuine civic brotherhood for hollow corporate fan clubs.
And he brings the statistical receipts to back this up. He notes that civic group participation among men, things like joining the VFW, the Elks Lodge, the Masons, or local bowling leagues, dropped from a robust 74% in 1952 down to a staggering, culturally catastrophic 18% in 2022.
That statistic is just mind-blowing, 74% to 18%.
Those groups weren't just places to drink beer. They were the safety nets of society. They were where older men mentored younger men, where you found a job if you were laid off, where you found out who the good mechanics and doctors were.
And Riker illustrates the collapse of this deeply meaningful community with an anecdote that is both absurd and deeply disturbing.
He tells the story of a man in Houston who actually chose to skip his own father's funeral viewing because the timing conflicted with the online drop of limited edition Travis Scott Nike sneakers.
Let that sink in. A man traded the ultimate ancient familial duty of honoring his dead father for a 98% chance at buying a pair of culturally hyped shoes.
Riker defines this pathetic behavior as neotribalism. He argues that because men are biologically hardwired to seek a tribe and a hierarchy, but society has told them traditional male bonding is toxic, they are channeling that primal energy into consumerism.
Men are no longer bonding over shared moral values, bloodlines, or religious faith. They are bonding over supreme product drops, Marvel movies, and defending billionaires on Twitter.
He points to the massive cult-like followings of figures like Elon Musk or Mr. Beast as evidence that fundamentally broken, atomized men are desperately searching for an identity in corporate logos because society systematically stripped them of any higher noble purpose.
But the author is quick to point out that not all men are submitting to this docile consumer cult. And here's where Riker unpacks the concept of the NEET uprising.
For those who aren't familiar, NEET is an acronym that stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training.
Riker points out a truly shocking macroeconomic statistic. Currently, 25% of men aged 25 to 54 in the United States are not in the labor force.
1 in 4 prime working age men have simply opted out.
To put a human face on this massive data point, Riker tells the story of Daryl from Flint, Michigan. Daryl was a highly skilled welder who worked at the same manufacturing plant for 20 years.
But then the plant was bought out, and the new corporate management rolled out mandatory emotional intelligence training.
This training required the male factory workers to sit in circles, role-play vulnerability, and explore their softness.
Daryl didn't file a grievance, he didn't protest, he just put his tools in his truck and walked out, never to return.
Now, according to the book, Daryl makes more money streaming himself playing Call of Duty in his mother's basement than he did burning his lungs out at the welding factory.
And this is where Riker's framing is vital to understand the manosphere. He strongly argues that men like Daryl, these millions of men sitting in basements, are not lazy losers. They aren't depressed failures.
He frames this mass exodus from the workforce as a highly calculated, rational form of civil disobedience.
He explicitly compares these neat men to the philosophies of Henry David Thoreau retreating to Walden Pond to escape a corrupt society.
Riker contends that men are actively, consciously boycotting a modern labor market that consistently demeans physical work, mocks male stoicism as toxic, forces them to undergo humiliating corporate HR rituals, and artificially demands expensive college degrees for basic physical jobs like operating a forklift.
To the manosphere, these men playing video games aren't broken by the system. They are active resistors who are simply refusing to expend their labor to uphold a society that openly hates them.
So if millions of able-bodied men are actively opting out of the workforce and refusing to participate in society, what is happening to the critical institutions that have historically relied on traditional male strength and sacrifice?
Let's look at the final pillar of Riker's argument in Section 8, the military, immigration, and the war on religion.
The author briefly touches on national security and border policies, and his views here are incredibly blunt.
He claims the modern military apparatus has become completely consumed by ideological capture, prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics over actual lethal combat readiness.
He cites a shocking example, which he claims was buried by the press, where a critical B-52 bomber training mission was allegedly grounded simply because a transgender airman assigned to the crew hadn't met the necessary physical fitness benchmarks, but commanders were terrified of the career repercussions of replacing them.
And he doesn't stop with the Air Force. Riker heavily critiques the ongoing political push by feminist advocacy groups demanding full inclusion for women in elite, frontline combat units like the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers.
But here is his specific grievance. He argues that these activists demand the prestige, the access, and the career advancement slots of these elite units, without being willing to be held to the exact same grueling, bone-breaking physical standards and historic attrition rates that men have always endured.
For Riker, the theater of war doesn't care about equity, it doesn't care about HR policies, and it doesn't care about pronouns. It only cares about lethality, physics, and violence.
He believes that injecting this woke, politically correct ideology into the military creates a fundamentally weaker, divided, and distracted fighting force at the exact historical moment our geopolitical enemies who do not care about diversity are growing stronger and more aggressive.
And finally, Riker shifts his focus from the physical defense of the nation to the spiritual and moral defense, highlighting what he calls secular fundamentalism in his chapter on religion.
To illustrate the state's hostility toward traditional faith, he brings up the highly publicized, agonizing case of Joe Kennedy.
Kennedy was the Bremerton, Washington high school football coach who was fired, dragged through a grueling decade of legal hell, publicly smeared by the media, and nearly bankrupted.
His crime, simply taking a knee by himself to silently pray on the 50-yard line for a few seconds after his team's games had concluded.
And Riker uses the Kennedy case to introduce a really powerful conceptual framework he calls asymmetric tolerance.
He argues that in modern America, secularism isn't just the absence of religion. It has actually morphed into an uncompromising, aggressive state religion of its own.
Under the rules of asymmetric tolerance, the state rigorously and gleefully punishes any public expression of traditional Christian faith, driving it completely out of the schools, the courtrooms, and the digital public squares.
But simultaneously, that same state rewards, funds, and strictly enforces Marxist racial theories and radical gender ideologies as absolute, unquestionable moral dogmas.
Riker claims this isn't the government being neutral. It's the systematic, deliberate eradication of the foundational moral framework that originally built Western civilization.
Okay, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground here today, exploring some deeply controversial and complex concepts for you to consider.
Let's try to synthesize this entire deep dive into a cohesive understanding of Riker's overarching worldview.
Through all of these chapters, from education and courts to tech algorithms and the military, Riker is presenting a unified grand theory for the modern manosphere.
His core, inescapable argument is that every single modern institution has been deliberately re-engineered by hostile actors.
And the explicit purpose of that societal reengineering is to pathologize traditional masculinity, extract male labor and wealth, and reward absolute ideological compliance.
And where I find most striking is how the book ends. Riker's final call to arms to his readers is not a call for violent political revolution.
He doesn't tell them to storm the barricades or vote harder.
His solution is a radical, quiet withdrawal of consent. He's urging men to stop apologizing for their biology.
He is telling them to step away from hostile corporate HR departments, to log off of aggressively censored digital environments, and to actively build their own parallel physical networks and underground communities.
He sees the future of manhood not in trying to reform a corrupt current system, but in completely seceding from its cultural expectations and letting it collapse under its own weight.
Whether you, the listener, found this worldview profoundly challenging, deeply alarming, or intensely validating, there is absolutely no denying that it represents a massive, influential, and rapidly growing force in today's culture.
You cannot understand the modern political landscape without understanding these arguments. If you are part of this movement, or if you are simply a curious observer who wants to deeply understand the actual arguments driving this cultural rebellion firsthand, you really need to engage with this text.
If you want to read Conrad Riker's full, unfiltered arguments, the author asks that you check out the ebook Degenerate Lifestyles, enabled by leftist Satanism, on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
You can also follow his ongoing, incredibly active work by subscribing to @ConradandRiker at Substack.
Absolutely.
And if you appreciate us taking the time and effort to objectively unpack and analyze these complex, highly charged cultural texts for you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel.
It is the best way to support the show and allows us to keep doing this deep analytical work for you week after week.
Before we sign off today, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've discussed, but wasn't directly answered in the pages of the book itself.
Here is the lingering question I want you to deeply consider. If millions of men are actively choosing to secede from the traditional workforce, if they are abandoning the digital public squares and forming their own encrypted underground societies away from the eyes of the state, what happens to the broader social contract?
When an entire demographic, specifically the demographic historically responsible for maintaining physical infrastructure and defense, decides the game is completely rigged and simply refuses to play anymore, who builds the roads? Who fights the wars?
Is a societal reconciliation even possible at this late stage? Or are we currently watching the permanent, irreversible fracturing of shared American society? Think about that.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.